The dust rises before you see them. A wall of it, low and wide, spreading across the horizon like a plague. You are standing on the northern plains of India in the winter of 1299, and that dust means only one thing: the Mongols are coming. For decades, their name alone has emptied cities from China to Persia. They've toppled dynasties that stood for centuries. They've made pyramids of skulls and turned fertile kingdoms into ash. And now, they're here, at the gates of Delhi, led by a general whose reputation makes even hardened warriors whisper prayers. But what the Mongols don't know, what they cannot possibly imagine as they ride toward what they assume will be another easy conquest, is that waiting for them in the scrubland near a village called Kili are creatures from nightmare, mountains of flesh and ivory that will shatter everything they thought they knew about war. This is the story of the day the unstoppable horde stopped. The day war elephants met Mongol cavalry. The day Sultan Alauddin Khalji bet everything on a single, desperate gamble. And the day that one battle changed the course of 3 continents. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand what the Mongols had already done. By 1299, they controlled the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Genghis Khan's grandsons ruled from Korea to Hungary. They'd obliterated the Khwarezmian Empire, butchered Baghdad's 500,000 inhabitants, and turned the Silk Road into a Mongol highway. The historian Peter Jackson describes their military system as perhaps the most effective fighting force ever assembled before the modern age, a fusion of mobility, archery, psychological warfare, and ruthless discipline that made them nearly invincible. Their composite bows could pierce armor at 200 yards. Their horses were bred for endurance, capable of covering 100 miles in a day. Their commanders communicated across vast distances using a relay system of riders that could transmit orders faster than any army in the world. And they were coming for India. The Mongol general leading this invasion was named Qutlugh Khwaja, a prince of the Chagatai Khanate and a man who'd spent his entire life in the saddle. Contemporary Persian chroniclers like Rashid al-Din describe him as fearless to the point of recklessness, a commander who believed utterly in Mongol superiority. He'd participated in campaigns across Central Asia. He'd seen walled cities fall in days. He'd watched armies 3 times his size crumble before the Mongol cavalry's feigned retreats and devastating arrow storms. As far as Qutlugh Khwaja was concerned, the Delhi Sultanate was just another domino waiting to fall. He had reason for confidence. The Mongols had already raided India multiple times over the previous 50 years, each time penetrating deeper, each time leaving behind burned villages and traumatized populations. The Sultanate's armies had never decisively defeated them. At best, Delhi's forces had survived through defensive tactics, retreating behind walls and waiting for the Mongols to leave. But Qutlugh Khwaja wasn't planning a raid this time. He was planning a conquest. His army, estimated by the historian Ziauddin Bahani at somewhere between 20 and 30,000 horsemen, represented one of the largest Mongol forces ever assembled for an Indian campaign. They crossed the Indus River in late 1299, swept through Punjab, and aimed straight for Delhi itself, the jewel of northern India, home to perhaps 500,000 souls. In Delhi, Sultan Alauddin Khalji received the news with the kind of cold calculation that defined his reign. Alauddin was not beloved. He'd seized the throne just 4 years earlier by murdering his uncle and predecessor, Jalaluddin Khalji, at a feast. He ruled through fear, intelligence networks, and an almost paranoid attention to potential threats. But he was also brilliant, ruthless, and utterly committed to preserving his empire. The medieval historian Amir Khusrau, who lived through this period and served in Alauddin's court, describes the Sultan as a man who never slept soundly unless his enemies slept in the ground. When word reached him that the largest Mongol army in decades was approaching his capital, Alauddin didn't panic. He prepared. But preparation meant confronting a terrible reality: his army couldn't fight the Mongols the way the Mongols fought. Delhi's forces were built around heavy cavalry, infantry, and one weapon the Mongols had never faced in significant numbers: war elephants. These weren't the elephants you see in zoos. Asian war elephants in their prime stood nearly 10 feet at the shoulder and weighed 4 to 5 tons of muscle, rage, and raw power. They were fitted with armor, sheets of quilted fabric reinforced with metal plates that covered their flanks and heads. Their tusks were capped with iron blades. Towers or howdahs sat on their backs, carrying archers who could rain arrows down from a stable platform 12 feet above the battlefield. And they were trained, from birth, to fight. To charge. To trumpet their fury. To crush men and horses beneath feet the size of dinner plates. The Delhi Sultanate maintained hundreds of these creatures. They were expensive, each elephant required massive amounts of food, specialized handlers called mahouts, and years of training. But they were worth it. In close combat, nothing on earth was more terrifying. Horses, no matter how well trained, feared them instinctively. The smell alone could send cavalry into panic. And when an elephant charged, when you felt the ground shake and heard that scream, that high, piercing trumpet that sounds like the earth itself is screaming, you understood why emperors paid fortunes to own them. Alauddin Khalji owned many. And he was about to use them all. The Sultan's plan was dangerous, perhaps suicidal. Instead of hiding behind Delhi's walls and enduring a siege, he would march out and meet the Mongols in open battle. This went against every defensive instinct, every lesson learned from previous Mongol invasions. But Alauddin understood something crucial: if he let the Mongols besiege Delhi, they would devastate the surrounding countryside, destroying the agricultural base his empire depended on. Worse, a siege would give his many enemies, rival nobles, discontented generals, ambitious relatives, time to plot against him. He needed a decisive victory, fast and overwhelming, to secure both his borders and his throne. So he assembled his army. Bahani estimates the Delhi force at perhaps 40,000 men, though medieval numbers are always uncertain. What's clear is that Alauddin gathered every elephant he could muster. Sources suggest somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 war elephants, an absolutely staggering number. He placed his most loyal commander, a general named Zafar Khan, in charge of the Elephant Corps. Zafar Khan was a convert to Islam, originally a Mongol himself who defected to Delhi years earlier, and he knew how the enemy thought, how they moved, how they fought. If anyone could use elephants to break a Mongol cavalry charge, it was him. The armies met near Kili, a small village north of Delhi, in December 1299. The season mattered. Winter in northern India is dry and cool, the air sharp, visibility perfect for miles. You can see dust clouds from horsemen hours before they arrive. You can hear the jingle of harnesses, the low rumble of thousands of hooves, long before you see riders. Both armies knew exactly where the other was. There would be no ambush, no surprise. Just two forces, each absolutely convinced of their superiority, marching toward each other with the fate of India hanging in the balance. The Mongols arrived first and formed their standard deployment, a wide crescent, with light cavalry on the wings and heavier units in the center, ready to encircle, to feint, to draw the enemy forward and then crush them from the sides. Qutlugh Khwaja sat his horse in the center, surrounded by his personal guard, watching the horizon. And then he saw them. The elephants emerged from the dust-like moving fortresses, hundreds of them, arrayed in a massive formation that stretched across the plain. Even from a distance, you could hear them, the trumpet calls, the rumble of their footsteps, a sound like continuous thunder. Behind them came the cavalry, rank after rank of armored horsemen with lances and swords. And in the center, beneath the Sultan's banner, rode Alauddin Khalji himself, watching his enemy, waiting for the moment to strike. For the first time in decades, the Mongols hesitated. The wind shifts, carrying the scent of elephant dung and terror across the plain. You're a Mongol warrior in Qutlugh Khwaja's front line, and you've fought in a dozen campaigns. You've seen Chinese crossbowmen, Persian heavy cavalry, Russian princes in their fortress cities. You've never lost. But you've also never seen anything like what's in front of you now. The elephants stand in formation, swaying slightly, their mahouts perched high on their backs, waiting. Your horse is acting strange, tossing its head, stepping sideways. The animal can smell them. Horses have an instinctive terror of elephants, written into their blood over millions of years of evolution. Your commanders know this. They've heard stories about elephants from campaigns in Persia, from traders, from captured soldiers. But stories aren't the same as standing 300 yards from a living wall of them, watching their ears flap, seeing sunlight glint off the iron caps on their tusks. Qutlugh Khwaja makes his decision quickly. The Mongols didn't conquer half the world by being cautious. Their entire tactical system depends on mobility, on using speed and archery to wear down opponents before closing for the kill. So he orders the standard opening. Loose formations of horse archers will ride forward, pepper the enemy with arrows, and retreat, drawing the Delhi forces out of position, fragmenting their formation, creating openings for the main attack. It's worked 1,000 times before. It should work now. The Mongol horsemen advance at a canter, bows already in hand. They ride in loose groups, spread wide to present difficult targets, staying just within effective arrow range. As the historian David Morgan notes in his work on Mongol warfare, this opening gambit was designed to be psychologically devastating as much as physically damaging. The constant harassment, the arrows coming from multiple directions, the impossibility of catching the swift Mongol horses, it broke armies before the main battle even began. Commanders would lose patience, order charges, watch their formations disintegrate, and die wondering how it all went wrong so fast. But Zafar Khan doesn't take the bait. He's fought Mongols before. He knows their tactics because they used to be his tactics. Instead of ordering a countercharge, he has the elephants advance slowly, maintaining formation, a moving fortress that doesn't break, doesn't scatter, just keeps coming forward like a tide. Behind them, the Delhi cavalry stays in position, protected by the enormous bodies in front. The Mongol arrows fly, you can hear them, a sound like cloth tearing, hundreds of shafts whistling through the air. Most bounce off the elephant's armor. Some find gaps, sinking into flesh, but an elephant can absorb dozens of arrow wounds and keep fighting. The creatures trumpet in anger, not fear, and continue their advance. This isn't going according to plan. The Mongol horse archers wheel away, regroup, try different angles. They target the mahouts, the riders, trying to kill the men controlling these beasts. A few mahouts fall, slumping in their seats or tumbling from their perches. But most elephants don't need much guidance once they're committed to a charge. They're trained to fight, and now they smell horses, hear the battle sounds, feel the rhythm of war. They're not stopping. Qutlugh Khwaja commits more forces. Heavier cavalry now, warriors with lances and sabers, trying to find weak points in the elephant line. The Delhi forces respond. Archers in the howdahs begin shooting back, not randomly, but in coordinated volleys. Amir Khusrau, in his contemporary account, describes how the howdah archers were trained specifically for this role. Elevated positions gave them clear sight lines over the heads of their own troops, and they could sustain fire while the elephants moved, something ground-based archers couldn't do effectively. The Mongols start taking casualties. Not devastating losses, but enough to matter, enough to make the calculus of this battle start shifting in uncomfortable directions. And then the Delhi cavalry charges. It comes from the wings, not the center, a flanking maneuver timed perfectly to coincide with the elephant advance. Zafar Khan has kept the bulk of his horsemen hidden behind the elephant line, and now they burst forward in two massive columns, sweeping around the sides while the elephants hold the center. The Mongols respond instantly, their wing cavalry wheeling to meet this new threat, and suddenly there are thousands of horsemen colliding in clouds of dust and screaming metal. This is the kind of close-quarters cavalry melee the Mongols usually avoid, but they have no choice now. If they don't stop these flanking charges, they'll be surrounded. You hear it before you feel it, a sound that makes your stomach drop, a rumble that isn't hoofbeats, isn't thunder, is something older and more terrible. The elephants are charging. Not all of them, not yet, but enough. Zafar Khan has unleashed perhaps 500 of them in the center, and they're moving faster than anything that large should be able to move, their mahouts urging them forward, their tusks lowered, their trunks curled up against their bodies. And they're screaming. That's the only word for it. The elephant war cry is like nothing else in nature, high-pitched, piercing, loud enough to hurt your ears at close range. It's a sound designed by evolution to terrify predators, and it works on humans just as effectively. The Mongol horses panic. Even the best-trained war horses, even the steppe-bred mounts that have carried warriors across Asia, react to that sound and that smell with pure instinct. Some rear. Some bolt. The riders fight to control them, dragging on reins, shouting, trying to maintain formation, but it's like trying to hold back a flood. The center of the Mongol line begins to disintegrate not because the warriors are cowards but because their horses simply will not face the elephants. The mounted archer, the core of Mongol military power, becomes useless when the horse refuses to obey. And then the elephants hit. An elephant moving at full charge carries the momentum of a small truck. When that mass collides with a horse and rider, the result isn't a fight, it's physics. Horses are trampled, crushed into the ground, their screams mixing with the trumpet calls. Riders who aren't immediately killed try to scatter, but elephants in battle rage don't just charge forward, they use their trunks to grab men, lifting them and hurling them like toys, or they use their tusks, goring with those iron-capped points that can punch through armor. The mahouts guide them but barely. At this point, the elephants are fighting on instinct, on training, on rage. Qutlugh Khwaja sees his center collapsing and makes the hardest decision a commander can make. He commits his reserve. Every army keeps elite troops in reserve for the critical moment, and for the Mongols, that means their heavy cavalry, the armored shock troops who fight with lances and close-quarter weapons. These are the wealthiest warriors, wearing lamellar armor, riding the best horses, trained since childhood. They're supposed to be the hammer that breaks the enemy after the arrows and mobility have worn them down. Instead, Qutlugh Khwaja is throwing them into the center to stop his line from breaking entirely. They charge into the elephant formation with suicidal courage. Some try to attack the elephants directly, riding close and stabbing upward with lances, aiming for the eyes or the gaps in armor. A few elephants go down, trumpeting in pain, collapsing on their knees. But for every elephant that falls, dozens of Mongol warriors die. The mahouts aren't passive, they're stabbing down with spears, and the howdah archers are shooting almost point-blank into the mass of Mongol cavalry. The ground becomes slick with blood, so much blood that horses lose their footing. Bodies pile up. The dust is so thick you can barely see 10 feet in any direction, and in that dust, men are dying by the hundreds. On the wings, the cavalry battle has devolved into chaos. Neither side has a clear advantage. The Mongols are better individual riders, more experienced, but the Delhi cavalry has numbers and they're fighting for their homes, their families, their sultan. Men hack at each other with swords, grapple and fall from their horses, stab upward at mounted opponents. It's exhausting, brutal work. Your arm burns from swinging your saber. Your throat is raw from shouting. You can't tell who's winning. But in the center, the elephants are winning. Zafar Khan orders the second wave forward, another 1,000 elephants, these held in reserve specifically for this moment. They surge into the battle, fresh, angry, unstoppable. The Mongol center doesn't just break, it shatters. Warriors who've never retreated in their lives turn their horses and run, not from cowardice but from pure survival instinct. You cannot fight what you cannot hurt, and even the most disciplined soldier breaks when he watches his comrades being trampled and gored while his own weapons bounce harmlessly off quilted armor. Qutlugh Khwaja tries to rally them. He rides into the center himself, his personal guard around him, shouting orders, trying to reform the line. For a moment, it almost works. The warriors around him stop fleeing, turn to face the elephants, draw their bows. But then Zafar Khan spots the Mongol commander's banner, recognizes what it means, and directs a full elephant charge straight at that position. 20 elephants, moving in a wedge formation, their mahouts screaming encouragement, bearing down on Qutlugh Khwaja and his guard. The Mongol prince has seconds to make a choice. He can stand and die gloriously, becoming a martyr for a battle that's already lost, or he can retreat and possibly save what remains of his army. He chooses survival. The guard surrounds him, and they ride, not a rout, not yet, but a fighting retreat, firing arrows backward, trying to cover the withdrawal of other units. But retreat is contagious. Once the center pulls back, the wings have to follow or risk being surrounded. The Delhi cavalry, seeing the Mongols withdraw, presses harder. Sultan Alauddin Khalji himself rides forward, his presence on the battlefield electrifying his troops. The Mongols, who've terrorized Asia for decades, who've toppled empires and made king's bow, are retreating from Delhi's army. The psychological effect is enormous. The retreat becomes a rout. Not a complete disaster, the Mongols maintain enough discipline to avoid total annihilation, but a decisive defeat. They flee north, toward Punjab, toward the Indus, leaving behind thousands of dead and wounded. The Delhi forces pursue but carefully. Zafar Khan knows that even a defeated Mongol army is dangerous, and exhausted elephants are vulnerable. The pursuit lasts for miles but not days. By nightfall, the Battle of Kili is over. The field is a nightmare. Bodies everywhere, human and horse, the ground churned into bloody mud. Wounded elephants trumpet in pain. Survivors wander in shock. The mahouts work to calm their animals, to tend their wounds, to remove the arrows that bristle from the quilted armor like porcupine quills. The Sultan walks the battlefield, observing, calculating. He's won, decisively, but he knows this isn't over. The Mongols will come again. They always come again. Except this time, they don't. The news travels faster than any army could march. By the time Qutlugh Khwaja's shattered forces limp back across the Indus River, word of the defeat has already reached the Chagatai court. Mongol survivors tell stories that sound like fevered dreams, mountains of flesh that couldn't be killed, beasts that screamed like demons and crushed horses like insects, an army that didn't break under arrow storms. The chronicler Rashid al-Din records the shock that rippled through the Mongol leadership. They'd lost battles before, a handful of defeats scattered across decades of conquest, but never like this. Never so decisively. Never to an enemy using tactics and weapons they had no answer for. In Delhi, Sultan Alauddin Khalji understands immediately what he's achieved. This isn't just a military victory, it's a psychological earthquake. For 50 years, the Mongol threat has hung over India like a storm cloud, raids coming every few years, each one penetrating deeper, each one more destructive. The various Delhi sultans before him had tried different strategies, paying tribute, building forts, avoiding open battle. None of it worked permanently. The Mongols always came back. But now, for the first time, an Indian army has met them in open battle and won. Not by hiding behind walls. Not by waiting them out. By marching out and breaking them in the field. The Sultan doesn't celebrate publicly. He's too calculating for that. Instead, he immediately begins fortifying the victory politically and militarily. He sends messages to every corner of his empire describing the battle, making sure everyone knows what happened at Kili. He rewards the commanders and soldiers who fought well, particularly Zafar Khan, whose tactical brilliance made the victory possible. He orders the elephant corps expanded and improved, more animals captured and trained, more mahouts recruited, more armor forged. And he begins constructing a network of forts along the northwestern frontier, creating a defensive infrastructure designed to blunt future Mongol invasions before they reach Delhi. But more importantly, he changes how wars are fought in India. The Battle of Kili becomes a template. Before 1299, war elephants were used in Indian warfare, but not systematically, not as the centerpiece of military doctrine. After Kili, every major power in the subcontinent reorganizes around elephant warfare. The animals become strategic assets, worth their weight in gold, the difference between victory and annihilation. The historian Peter Jackson notes that the battle fundamentally altered the military balance in South Asia, creating a defensive advantage for settled kingdoms that would persist for generations. The Mongols, for their part, never mount another major invasion of India during Alauddin Khalji's reign. They try a few raids in the following years, but nothing on the scale of 1299. The Chagatai Khanate has other problems: succession disputes, wars with other Mongol factions, the ongoing collapse of unified Mongol power. And honestly, the cost-benefit analysis no longer makes sense. Why throw armies at an enemy that has proven they can break you in open battle when there are easier targets elsewhere? The historian Hugh Kennedy argues that Kili represents a turning point, the moment when the Mongol westward expansion definitively stops. They'd already failed to conquer Japan, failed to hold Hungary, and now they'd failed to take India. The age of limitless Mongol conquest was over. But to understand why this matters beyond the immediate military result, you have to zoom out and look at what Kili preserved. The Delhi Sultanate wasn't just another kingdom. It was a center of Islamic culture, learning, and commerce in South Asia. The Sultan's court patronized poets like Amir Khusrau, who wrote in Persian and developed early forms of Hindustani literature. Delhi's markets connected Indian goods to the broader Islamic world, channeling spices, textiles, and precious stones westward while bringing ideas, technologies, and religions eastward. If the Mongols had conquered Delhi the way they conquered Baghdad, that cultural synthesis would have been shattered. Consider what happened to other places the Mongols conquered in the 13th century. Baghdad, once the intellectual heart of the Islamic world, never fully recovered from the 1258 sacking. The House of Wisdom, with its priceless collection of manuscripts, was destroyed. Scholars estimate that hundreds of thousands of books were thrown into the Tigris River, so many that the water reportedly turned black with ink. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured for 5 centuries, ended in a single brutal week. Central Asian cities like Samarkand and Bukhara were devastated, their populations massacred or enslaved. The irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for millennia were destroyed, turning fertile regions into semi-deserts. Delhi escaped that fate because of elephants. Because Sultan Alauddin Khalji gambled everything on a single battle. Because Zafar Khan understood both Mongol tactics and how to counter them. Because mahouts trained their animals for years, teaching them to charge instead of flee, to trumpet instead of panic. Because thousands of soldiers stood their ground when every instinct screamed to run. The preservation of Delhi meant the preservation of a cultural world. The battle also changes how the Mongols see themselves. For 3 generations, since Genghis Khan first unified the steppe tribes, Mongol identity has been built around invincibility. They were the scourge of God, the unstoppable force that toppled empires. That mythology sustained their political unity even as the empire fragmented into competing khanates. But after Kili, after Japan, after Hungary, the myth is cracking. If Mongols can be decisively defeated by inferior numbers, if their horses can be panicked by elephants, if their tactics can be countered, then maybe they're not invincible after all. Maybe they're just excellent warriors who've hit the limits of what their military system can achieve. The consequences ripple across Asia for decades. Other kingdoms study the Battle of Kili, trying to understand the lessons. How do you stop Mongol cavalry? Make them fight on your terms. How do you counter their mobility? Use weapons and tactics they can't easily adapt to. How do you break their psychological advantage? Stand and fight instead of cowering behind walls. It sounds simple in retrospect, but it required someone to actually do it first, to prove it was possible. Alauddin Khalji himself becomes more ambitious after Kili. With the Mongol threat neutralized, he turns his attention south, launching a series of campaigns that bring much of the Indian subcontinent under Delhi's control. He conquers Gujarat, Ranthambore, Chitta, and pushes into the Deccan Plateau. His armies reach farther south than any Delhi Sultan before him. The historian Ziauddin Bahani, writing a generation later, describes Alauddin as perhaps the most powerful ruler India had seen since the ancient Mauryan Empire. That expansion is possible only because Kili secured his northern frontier. But there's a darker side to Alauddin's reign that intensifies after the victory. The Sultan becomes increasingly paranoid, increasingly brutal. He establishes an extensive spy network to monitor his nobles and generals. He implements harsh economic controls, fixing prices and confiscating the property of wealthy merchants. He prohibits alcohol and public gatherings, fearing they'll be used to plot against him. When nobles do rebel, the punishments are savage: executions, mutilations, mass arrests. Amir Khusrau, the court poet, carefully avoids mentioning these aspects in his official histories, but other sources paint a picture of a ruler who trusts no one and rules through fear. You could argue that this paranoia is partly a result of Kili. The victory proves that Alauddin's aggressive, risky strategy can work, and that success makes him more willing to take extreme measures in other areas of governance. If gambling everything on a single battle can save the empire, why not gamble on radical economic reforms? Why not crush potential rivals before they become actual threats? The line between decisive leadership and tyranny blurs, and Alauddin crosses it repeatedly in his later years. Yet for all his cruelty, for all his paranoia, he keeps Delhi safe. The Mongols never conquer India. Islamic culture continues to develop and synthesize with Hindu traditions, creating the rich cultural fusion that will eventually produce the Mongol Empire. Trade routes stay open. Cities grow. Agriculture flourishes. Millions of people live their lives unaware that they owe their safety to a battle fought near an obscure village called Kili. The elephants themselves become legendary. Stories spread across Asia about the invincible war elephants of Delhi, growing more exaggerated with each retelling. By the time Marco Polo writes his accounts of Asian travels, he's heard multiple versions of the story, describing elephants in Indian armies as being so numerous and so terrifying that no cavalry dare approach them. The accounts aren't entirely accurate, but they capture a psychological truth. After Kili, war elephants represent a hard counter to steppe cavalry, a weapon that changes the strategic calculus of any invasion of India. Interestingly, the Mongols never develop an effective counter-tactic for massed elephant charges. They try various approaches in later conflicts: fire arrows to panic the animals, targeting mahouts exclusively, avoiding direct confrontation, but none prove consistently effective. The problem is fundamental: horses fear elephants instinctively, and no amount of training fully overcomes that fear. The Mongol military system is built around the horse archer, and when your primary weapon platform refuses to cooperate, your entire tactical doctrine collapses. Other armies face similar problems. When Alexander the Great fought King Porus at the Battle of Hydaspes in 326 BCE, his Macedonian cavalry struggled against Indian war elephants. Alexander won that battle through brilliant tactics and personal leadership, but even he couldn't find a clean solution to the elephant problem. His men fought the animals with sarissas, long pikes that could stab from a distance, and eventually wore down the elephants through sheer weight of numbers. But it was costly, exhausting, and not something you'd want to repeat if you had a choice. The Romans encountered war elephants multiple times, against Pyrrhus, against Hannibal, against various Hellenistic kingdoms, and never developed a reliable counter. They won battles despite the elephants, not because they solved the problem. The elephants remained terrifying, dangerous, unpredictable weapons that could turn the tide of battle or, if panicked, trample their own troops just as readily as the enemy's. What makes Kili unique is that the elephants work exactly as planned. There's no friendly fire incident, no panic among the animals, no mahouts losing control. The Delhi Elephant Corps performs with disciplined precision, charging when ordered, maintaining formation, responding to commands even in the chaos of battle. That level of training and coordination is what makes the victory possible. It's not just that Delhi has elephants, it's that they've mastered elephant warfare to a degree few civilizations ever achieved. Zafar Khan's role in this cannot be overstated. He's the tactical genius who makes it work, and his background as a former Mongol gives him unique insight. He knows how Mongol commanders think, knows they'll try the arrow harassment first, knows they'll expect the Delhi forces to break formation. So he does the opposite of what they expect at every turn. He keeps the elephants in tight formation instead of scattering them. He uses them as moving fortifications to protect his cavalry rather than as shock troops alone. He times the charge perfectly, waiting until the Mongol cavalry is committed and can't easily disengage. It's a masterpiece of battlefield command, and if you put a different general in charge, even with the same forces, the battle might end very differently. After Kili, Zafar Khan becomes one of the most powerful men in the Delhi Sultanate. Alauddin Khalji rewards him with land grants, titles, and command of the frontier defenses. But there's always an edge to the Sultan's generosity, always the implicit threat that comes with being too successful. In Alauddin's court, victory makes you valuable but also dangerous. The Sultan watches everyone, trusts no one completely, and maintains power through a careful balance of reward and fear. Zafar Khan walks that tightrope carefully, serving loyally but never accumulating enough independent power to threaten the throne. He survives in Alauddin's court by being indispensable but never irreplaceable, competent but never ambitious. It's an exhausting game, and many of his fellow generals don't play it as well. Some are executed on trumped-up charges of treason. Others are quietly poisoned. A few rebel and are crushed. Zafar Khan endures by understanding that in Delhi, military genius alone isn't enough, you need political survival skills too. The years after Kili see a transformation in how India defends itself. The Sultan doesn't just expand the Elephant Corps, he professionalizes it. Mahouts become a specialized military caste, their training formalized, their knowledge passed down through generations. The best mahouts can communicate with their elephants through subtle pressure from their legs, through specific vocal commands that the animals recognize even in the chaos of battle. They learn medicine, how to treat arrow wounds, how to recognize when an elephant is sick or injured, how to manage the enormous beasts during must, the periodic aggressive state that makes male elephants nearly uncontrollable. Young boys begin training as mahouts at age 7 or 8, spending years learning the craft before they're trusted with a war elephant. The elephants themselves are selected carefully. Not every elephant makes a good war animal. They're looking for males in their prime, between 20 and 40 years old, large but not so massive they're slow, aggressive but controllable. Female elephants are rarely used in battle, they're smaller, less aggressive, and too valuable for breeding. Each war elephant represents years of investment. They're captured young, usually from wild herds in the forests of eastern India or brought as tribute from smaller kingdoms. Then begins the training, teaching them to tolerate armor, to respond to commands, to charge instead of fleeing, to ignore the screams and chaos of battle. Some elephants never adapt. They remain skittish, unpredictable, dangerous to their own side. Those animals are relegated to transport or labor. The ones that excel become worth more than their weight in gold. The armor technology improves too. The quilted padding used at Kili works but isn't optimal. Armorsmiths experiment with layered designs, cloth, leather, and metal plates that distribute impact while remaining flexible enough for the elephant to move. They develop specialized protection for the trunk, the most vulnerable part, fashioning leather sheaths studded with metal rings. The tusks get more sophisticated caps, designed not just to protect but to maximize damage, with serrated edges that can tear through armor and flesh. The howdahs become small fortresses, with walls thick enough to stop arrows and openings designed for multiple archers to fire simultaneously. But the real innovation is tactical. Delhi's military strategists study Kili obsessively, trying to understand what worked and what could be improved. They realize that elephants are most effective when used in coordinated waves, not all at once. The first wave breaks the enemy formation. The second wave exploits the gaps. The third wave, held in reserve, delivers the final blow or covers a retreat if needed. They develop signals, trumpet calls, flag movements, specific drum patterns that allow commanders to direct elephant units across a chaotic battlefield. They practice combined arms tactics, using cavalry to protect the elephant's flanks and infantry to support them in close combat. These lessons spread beyond Delhi. The Vijayanagara Empire, rising in southern India, builds its own elephant corps. The Bengal Sultanate does the same. Even smaller kingdoms scramble to acquire war elephants, understanding that without them, they're vulnerable to larger neighbors who have them. A military arms race develops, but one centered on biology rather than metallurgy. The kingdom with the most and best elephants has a decisive advantage in any conflict. Interestingly, this changes the economics of warfare in India. Wars become shorter because they're more decisive. When both sides have elephant corps, battles tend to be all-or-nothing affairs. The side that loses its elephants loses the war. This makes rulers more cautious about committing to open battle. Diplomacy becomes more important. Alliances shift more carefully. The elephants are simultaneously weapons and deterrents, too valuable to risk unless absolutely necessary. As the historian Richard Eaton notes, medieval Indian warfare after Kili resembles a slow-motion chess game, with elephants as the queens, powerful, decisive, but too precious to sacrifice lightly. The Mongols, meanwhile, adapt to their new reality. If India is too difficult to conquer, they'll focus elsewhere. The Chagatai Khanate turns its attention to internal consolidation, to trade, to managing the territories it already controls. The Illinois Khanate in Persia becomes increasingly independent, converting to Islam and developing its own distinct culture. The Golden Horde on the Russian steppes carves out its sphere of influence. The Yuan dynasty in China faces its own challenges, governing a massive Chinese population that vastly outnumbers the Mongol elite. The unified Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan's vision fragments into competing states that often fight each other as readily as they fight outsiders. Kili accelerates this fragmentation. When the myth of Mongol invincibility breaks, it undermines the ideological glue holding the empire together. Local Mongol rulers start thinking more about their own kingdoms and less about the broader Mongol project. Why risk your armies conquering new territories for a distant Great Khan when you could consolidate what you have and enrich yourself through trade? The psychology shifts from conquest to consolidation, from expansion to exploitation of existing holdings. Sultan Alauddin Khalji dies in 1316, probably murdered by his own courtiers who'd grown tired of his paranoid brutality. His death triggers immediate chaos. His sons fight over succession. Generals rebel. The empire he built through ruthless efficiency begins to crack. But the military reforms survive. The Elephant Corps remains intact. The frontier forts stay manned. And crucially, the Mongols still don't invade. Whatever internal problems Delhi faces, the external threat that dominated the previous century has been neutralized. Future Delhi sultans are weak, incompetent, or both, but they inherit a military system and defensive infrastructure that protects them despite their flaws. The elephants become symbols. They appear on coins, in palace decorations, in the poetry and art of the period. Amir Khusrau writes verses comparing Sultan Alauddin to a mahout who tames the wild beasts of chaos and brings order to the realm. The metaphor is heavy-handed but revealing. In the cultural imagination of medieval India, elephants represent controlled power, civilization imposing order on nature's raw force. The fact that these animals can be trained to fight, to follow commands, to serve human purposes, becomes a metaphor for governance itself. Foreign travelers marvel at them. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan explorer who visits India in the 1330s, writes extensively about war elephants in his travel accounts. He describes watching a parade of 300 elephants in Delhi, each draped in silk, their tusks capped with gold, their mahouts wearing ceremonial uniforms. He notes how rulers gift elephants to each other as the ultimate diplomatic present, more valuable than gold, more prestigious than jewels. An elephant gift signals respect, alliance, or in some cases, subtle intimidation. It's saying, I have so many of these devastating weapons that I can afford to give one away. But Ibn Battuta also records something interesting. By the 1330s, elephants are used less often in actual battle and more often in sieges and executions. They've become too valuable to risk in open combat except in the most desperate circumstances. Instead, they're used to break down fortress gates, to transport siege equipment, to intimidate besieged garrisons into surrendering. And they're used for spectacular public executions, trampling condemned prisoners as crowds watch. The war elephant is transforming from primarily a battlefield weapon into a multifaceted tool of state power, military, but also psychological, ceremonial, symbolic. This evolution suggests that Kili's lessons are being learned, perhaps too well. Elephants prove decisive against Mongol cavalry, but that specific threat is fading. Future conflicts are more likely to be against other Indian kingdoms, which means fighting enemies who also have elephants. When both sides have the same devastating weapon, neither side has an advantage, and battles become bloodier and less decisive. The battlefield calculus changes. Infantry becomes more important again. Fortifications matter more. The era of elephant-dominated warfare peaks and then gradually declines, not because elephants become less effective, but because everyone has them and everyone knows how to use them. Yet the memory of Kili persists. Chroniclers writing decades later still describe it as the greatest victory of the age, the day Delhi saved itself and all of India from the Mongol storm. The battle enters popular memory, told and retold, embellished and mythologized. In some versions, the elephants are twice as large as reality. In others, Alauddin Khalji personally fights in single combat against Qutlugh Khwaja. The facts blur into legend, but the core truth remains: when it mattered most, when an unstoppable force met an immovable object, the elephants won. For the Mongols, Kili becomes the battle they don't talk about. It's not recorded prominently in their own chronicles. Rashid al-Din mentions it briefly, without the detailed analysis he gives to Mongol victories. The defeat is embarrassing, a stain on the reputation of Mongol invincibility, so it's downplayed, minimized, eventually half forgotten in official Mongol historiography. But the strategic consequences are undeniable. after 1299, the Mongols never again seriously threaten India. The subcontinent remains outside their empire, a prize that got away, a reminder that even the greatest military force in history has limits. Those limits are partly technological. The elephants represent a weapon system the Mongols can't effectively counter with their existing military doctrine. But they are also geographic and logistical. India is far from the Mongol heartland. Supply lines are long. The terrain is unfamiliar. The climate is harsh. And the potential rewards, while substantial, aren't worth the risk. After Kili proves how costly Indian campaigns can be. Better to consolidate Persia, manage Central Asia, squeeze tribute from Russian principalities. The cost-benefit analysis changes, and India becomes someone else's problem. This has profound consequences for world history. India remains largely independent during the Mongol century, which means Indian culture, Indian trade, Indian religions continue to develop along their own trajectories rather than being subsumed into a Mongol imperial system. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam in its Indian forms, all survive and evolve without the massive disruption that Mongol conquest brings elsewhere. The maritime trade networks that connect India to Southeast Asia, East Africa, and eventually Europe continue functioning. Indian mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers keep working, keep innovating, keep adding to humanity's collective knowledge. You could argue that modern India's cultural diversity, its religious pluralism, its synthesis of traditions, is partly a result of Kili. Because the Mongols didn't conquer and homogenize the subcontinent the way they did with so much of Asia. Because local kingdoms survived, competed, and synthesized with each other rather than being crushed under a uniform Mongol administration. Because elephants, those magnificent, terrifying, powerful animals, gave Indian civilizations the breathing room to develop on their own terms. The elephants themselves fade from military use gradually. Gunpowder weapons eventually render them obsolete. A cannon can kill an elephant from a distance, and a musket volley can panic an entire elephant corps. By the 16th century, when the Mughal Empire conquers India using firearms and field artillery, war elephants are relegated to ceremonial roles. But their descendants still serve, carrying emperors in processions, participating in festivals, reminding everyone of a time when these creatures were the most powerful weapons on earth. Old mahouts tell stories to their grandchildren about the glory days, about battles where a single elephant could break an entire cavalry squadron, about the thunder of thousands of them charging across dusty plains. The stories are probably exaggerated, but not by much. The reality of elephant warfare was spectacular enough that embellishment is barely necessary. In the decades after Alauddin Khalji's death, the Delhi Sultanate slowly weakens. Succession crises, rebellions, regional governors declaring independence, all the typical problems of medieval empires reassert themselves. But the Mongol threat never returns. Various Mongol successor states persist for centuries, the Golden Horde until the 15th century, Mongol dynasties in Persia until the 14th, the Yuan dynasty in China until the Ming overthrow them in 1368. But none of them attempt the systematic conquest of India. Kili's lesson is too clear, the cost is too high, the risks too great, the reward uncertain. India has proven it can defend itself, and that reputation alone becomes a shield. The battle also changes how military history is taught and understood in the Islamic world. Scholars writing about warfare study Kili as a case of successful defensive strategy against a seemingly superior foe. The key lessons: know your enemy's weaknesses, use terrain and timing to your advantage, commit reserves at the decisive moment, maintain discipline under pressure, become standard elements of military treatises. The historian Ibn Khaldun, writing his monumental work on civilization and history in the 14th century, references Indian military prowess and their use of elephants as an example of how sedentary civilizations can defend themselves against nomadic invaders. He doesn't mention Kili specifically, but the broader pattern he describes of agricultural societies finding ways to counter-step cavalry is precisely what happened at that battle. The mahouts themselves, those men who controlled the elephants and made victory possible, become something like a military aristocracy in their own right. They form guilds, passing their knowledge down through families, maintaining standards of training and conduct. A skilled mahout in the 14th or 15th century can command impressive wages. Kings compete for their services. They're courted, bribed, sometimes kidnapped by rival powers desperate to build their own elephant corps. The relationship between mahout and elephant is intensely personal. They often work with the same animal for decades, developing a bond that's part partnership, part domination, entirely mysterious to outsiders. A good mahout knows his elephant's moods, its quirks, its limits. He knows when to push and when to hold back, when the animal is ready to fight and when it needs rest. That knowledge is invaluable, irreplaceable, and it gives mahouts a power that transcends their official rank. There are darker aspects too, aspects the heroic narratives tend to skip. Training a war elephant isn't gentle. It requires breaking the animal's will, teaching it to fear its handlers more than it fears anything else, then rebuilding that relationship into something functional but fundamentally coercive. Young elephants captured from the wild are often chained, starved, beaten until they submit. The process is called crushing, and it's exactly as brutal as it sounds. Some elephants never recover psychologically. They become sullen, unpredictable, dangerous. Others adapt, but at immense psychological cost. The magnificent, terrifying war elephants that win battles are also, in many ways, traumatized animals forced into service. The human cost is significant too. Mahouts die regularly, crushed during training accidents, killed when elephants panic during battle, trampled when an animal goes into muth and becomes uncontrollable. The profession has a high mortality rate, yet men keep doing it because the rewards are substantial and because it offers upward mobility in a rigidly hierarchical society. A successful mahout can elevate his entire family, can accumulate wealth and status otherwise impossible for someone of his background. So they accept the risks, train the elephants, and sometimes pay with their lives. The elephants used at Kili probably don't survive long after the battle. War wounds, even when not immediately fatal, often lead to infections. Elephants that take multiple arrows might develop abscesses, festering wounds that kill slowly. Others are physically exhausted by the battle, their bodies pushed beyond sustainable limits, and die within days or weeks. The Delhi Sultanate probably loses hundreds of elephants in the aftermath of Kili, not to Mongol swords but to the delayed effects of combat. This attrition is one reason why maintaining an elephant corps is so expensive. You can't just win one battle and assume the animals will be ready for the next. You need a constant supply of new elephants, constant training, constant replacement of casualties. It's a logistical nightmare, and only wealthy, organized states can sustain it. The Mongols, in their scattered sources, occasionally revisit the question of India. Some Mongol commanders argue that the failure at Kili was due to poor tactics, that a different approach might have succeeded. Others suggest that elephants could be countered with specific strategies, digging trenches to break up elephant charges, using fire to panic the animals, targeting mahouts exclusively. A few Mongol generals even try to acquire their own elephants, thinking that if Indian kingdoms used them successfully, so could the Mongols. But these efforts never produce results. Elephants don't thrive in the dry Central Asian climate. The expertise required to train and maintain them doesn't exist in Mongol territories. And fundamentally, the Mongol military system is built around horses, not elephants. Trying to integrate elephants would require restructuring their entire approach to warfare, and by the 14th century, the unified Mongol Empire no longer exists to implement such reforms. Instead, the Mongol world fragments and evolves. In Persia, the Illinois Khanate adopts Persian culture, converts to Islam, and becomes essentially a Persian dynasty with Mongol ancestry. The Golden Horde does something similar with Turkic and Islamic influences. The Yuan dynasty in China becomes increasingly Chinese in character. Within a century of Genghis Khan's death, his empire has dissolved into regional powers that barely acknowledge each other. The dream of universal conquest, of Mongol armies riding from ocean to ocean, fades into memory. And at the center of this story, unlikely as it seems, are elephants. Not as symbols or metaphors, but as concrete military factors that change strategic calculations. The historian John Keegan, in his analysis of pre-modern warfare, notes that certain weapon systems create temporary but decisive advantages that reshape power balances. The Macedonian phalanx, the Roman legion, the English longbow, the Swiss pike square, each dominates for a period until counters are developed. War elephants had their moment in South and Southeast Asia, a window of several centuries where they were genuinely decisive battlefield weapons. Kili represents the peak of that effectiveness, the moment when elephants proved they could break the most formidable cavalry force ever assembled. But effectiveness in battle is only part of the story. Elephants also matter symbolically, psychologically, economically. They're expensive enough that only powerful states can maintain them, which means their presence signals strength and stability. They're spectacular enough that they dominate public consciousness, appearing in art, literature, and popular imagination far beyond their actual military utility. And they're exotic enough to foreigners that they become synonymous with India itself in the medieval mind. When European travelers eventually reach India in the 16th century, elephants are among the first things they comment on, marveling at their size, their training, their use in warfare and ceremony. The Battle of Kili fades from popular consciousness gradually. Later battles overshadow it. Panipat in 1526, where Babur establishes the Mughal Empire, or Talikota in 1565, where the Vijayanagara Empire falls. These conflicts involve gunpowder, tens of thousands of troops, dynasties rising and falling. Kili seems smaller by comparison, a regional battle with limited immediate consequences. But historians recognize its importance. It's the battle that stopped the Mongol westward expansion. It's the battle that proved Indian military systems could compete with the most advanced warfare of the age. It's the battle that preserved an entire civilization from conquest. Sultan Alauddin Khalji, for all his brutality, for all his paranoia and cruelty, achieved something remarkable. He faced an existential threat and not only survived but won decisively. He reorganized his military, gambled everything on a single battle, and emerged victorious. He created a defensive system that protected India for generations. His methods were often terrible, the executions, the spy networks, the economic controls that impoverished many while enriching the state. But the results are undeniable. When he died in 1316, the empire was secure, the borders were safe, and the Mongol threat was neutralized. Zafar Khan, the tactical genius behind the victory, survives the succession chaos after Alauddin's death. He serves the next few sultans, maintaining his position through competence and careful political maneuvering. Eventually he dies of natural causes, unusual for a high-ranking general in that brutal era. His legacy is the tactical innovations he introduced, the elephant warfare doctrine he perfected, the training systems he established. Future commanders study his methods. The elephant charges at Kili become textbook examples of combined arms warfare, of timing and coordination, of using the right weapon at the right moment. The elephants themselves, the individual animals that fought at Kili, leave no names in the historical record. They're anonymous, as most soldiers are, their individual stories lost to time. But collectively, they changed history. 2,000 to 3,000 elephants, trained by patient mahouts, armored and prepared, charging across a dusty plain near an obscure village, breaking an army that had terrorized Asia for generations. The ground shook with their footsteps. The air filled with their trumpet calls. And for one decisive afternoon, they were the most important force on earth. In the centuries that follow, the memory of Kili becomes hazier, the details blur, the participants fade into legend. But the consequences persist. India remains independent during the Mongol century. Islamic and Hindu cultures continue their complex, creative synthesis. Trade networks survive. Cities grow. Knowledge accumulates. And when historians look back, trying to understand why India's trajectory differed from China's or Persia's, why the subcontinent maintained its cultural distinctiveness despite the Mongol storm that swept across Eurasia, part of the answer lies in a single battle. The afternoon sun at Kili, filtering through dust and smoke, illuminating a field of death and triumph. The Mongol cavalry fleeing north, their myth of invincibility shattered. The Delhi forces exhausted, blooded, but victorious, understanding they've achieved something unprecedented. Sultan Alauddin Khalji watching from his position, calculating the political implications even as his men cheer. Zafar Khan directing the pursuit, knowing when to press and when to hold back. The mahouts tending to wounded elephants, speaking softly to animals that have just experienced the terror and chaos of warfare. And somewhere in that field, perhaps, a single elephant stands among the dead, its armor dented and blooded, an arrow still lodged in its shoulder, its mahout slumped but alive in the howdah on its back. The animal is exhausted, traumatized, hurting. But it's also still standing, still present, still the embodiment of power and endurance that made victory possible. That image, whether it happened exactly that way or not, captures the essence of Kili. Not the glory and heroism the poets describe, but the grim, painful, messy reality of warfare, where victory comes at enormous cost and where the difference between triumph and disaster often comes down to which side refuses to break, which army stands longest, which weapons prove most effective at the crucial moment. The elephant stood. The Mongols broke. And history turned on that difference. The story of Kili is ultimately about limits, the limits of Mongol expansion, the limits of any military system, the limits of conquest itself. For 60 years, the Mongols seemed limitless, expanding in every direction, conquering everything they touched. But every expansion reaches a boundary eventually. For the Mongols, India was that boundary. Not because Indians were better warriors, not because their civilization was stronger, but because they had the right weapon at the right time and the leadership to use it effectively. Elephants countered cavalry. Discipline countered mobility. Defensive strategy countered aggressive expansion. And in doing so, preserved a world.